Imagine finding a ship frozen in ice, perfectly preserved, yet empty. The journals stop mid-sentence, ink mixed with blood. No bodies, no explanation. Beneath the hull, the ice trembles, and a metallic taste fills your mouth as if the Arctic itself has learned to breathe by consuming everyone who came looking for the truth. The first thing to disappear was the silence. Long before hunger hollowed the men or ice crushed the hulls, the Arctic stole the illusion of stillness. Sound did not vanish here, it transformed. Beneath the frozen sea, something pressed and released with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a mammalian cadence that traveled upward through ice, through oak planks, through iron bolts, and settled deep in bone. The ships lay locked in a white infinity, embalmed rather than preserved, their masts rising like snapped ribs from a frozen carcass. Breath left mouths as ghosts and froze before it could escape, hanging briefly in the air before falling away as frost. The cold was not sharp at first. It was intimate. It crept inward, stiffening fingers, numbing faces, teaching the body new limits. Ink thickened, then froze in pens. Oil lamps burned reluctantly, their flames trembling as if aware they did not belong here. Blood slowed in veins, carrying with it a strange heaviness, and the men began to understand that the ice was not an object but a presence. It did not crush immediately. It waited. Below deck, the ships complained constantly. Wood contracted and expanded with gunshot cracks that echoed through sleeping quarters. Iron groaned under invisible pressure. At night, when lanterns were dimmed and bodies lay rigid in bunks, the hull seemed to flex, not from shifting ice alone, but from something beneath it. The sound was too measured, too regular, to be dismissed as chance. It resembled breathing, slow and patient, as if the sea itself were sleeping just below the planks. The men responded first with discipline. Logs were kept meticulously. Weather was recorded, routes calculated, duties enforced with stubborn precision. Routine became armor against the creeping unease. Yet even in these early days, subtle changes crept into the margins. Handwriting tightened. Lines grew darker where pens pressed too hard into paper. Pages smelled faintly of metal and damp wool, a scent that lingered on fingers long after the books were closed. Above deck, the horizon refused to behave. White swallowed distance, flattening sky and ground into a single, endless surface that erased direction and depth. The sun, when it appeared, hovered weakly, offering light without warmth, a pale witness that never lingered long. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ice, distorted by pressure ridges that resembled frozen waves, as if the sea had tried to rise and failed. At night, sleep came unevenly. Bodies lay still, but minds drifted. Some men felt the unmistakable sensation of motion despite the ships being trapped fast, as though they were being carried somewhere very slowly, very deliberately. Others woke with the taste of iron on their tongues, sharp and unmistakable, as if they had bitten down on a coin in their dreams. No one spoke of it aloud. Words felt dangerous here, too loud, too final. By the time the Arctic night settled in fully, stretching endlessly across the sky, the men understood something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer simply stranded. They had been noticed. And beneath the ice, whatever had been breathing did not hurry. It had time. The expedition journals began as instruments of order, an attempt to impose straight lines on a world that refused them. Each morning the pages filled with neat columns, latitude estimated beneath a colorless sky, wind direction guessed from drifting snow, temperature described in careful language that avoided panic. Discipline was recorded as faithfully as weather. Rations were counted, prayers noted, morale summarized in restrained phrases that suggested control even when none existed. Ink flowed evenly at first, confident strokes pressing certainty into paper as if the act itself could anchor the ships to reason. That confidence eroded quietly. The handwriting tightened, letters leaning inward as though bracing against pressure. Lines slanted where they had once stood upright. Margins filled with corrections, then with small, unnecessary marks, dots and dashes that served no purpose. The men continued to write because writing was expected, because silence felt dangerous, because leaving a page blank seemed like an admission that the Arctic had begun to dictate terms. The taste appeared without warning. It coated the tongue suddenly, sharp and coppery, as if a coin had been held there too long. Snow melted for drinking did nothing to remove it. Tea only intensified it, heat drawing the flavor deeper into the mouth and throat. Some noted it as a symptom, others as an observation without explanation. It appeared in the margins first, then crept into the body of entries, mentioned repeatedly in different hands, the same description resurfacing again and again as if the words themselves were being copied by something that had learned the language imperfectly. Canned provisions failed next. The tins, stacked neatly in holds and passageways, began to swell subtly, their surfaces bowing outward with a quiet menace. When opened, some released a sour stench that clung to clothing and hair, a smell of rot and metal intertwined. Others appeared intact, yet left men nauseated, dizzy, their heads pounding as if struck from within. The journals recorded these incidents cautiously, avoiding accusation, but the pattern was unmistakable. Solder, unseen and unconsidered, leached into meat and marrow, threading itself through bodies already weakened by cold and confinement. Physical symptoms multiplied. Headaches became constant, a dull pressure behind the eyes that no rest relieved. Hands trembled when writing, lines wavering across the page despite visible effort to steady them. Fingers numbed not only from cold but from something deeper, an internal sluggishness that slowed thought and reaction. Memories slipped sideways. Familiar procedures required effort. Names blurred. Tasks that had once been automatic now demanded concentration that exhausted what little strength remained. Maps began to change. At first, it was minor corrections, small adjustments made with the justification of better observation. Then coastlines bent in improbable ways, inlets extended where none should exist, distances compressed or expanded without explanation. Different maps contradicted one another, each claiming authority. When laid side by side, they suggested not error but movement, as though the land itself were shifting in response to being observed, refusing to hold still under scrutiny. The journals reflected this instability. Dates became inconsistent, days repeating or vanishing entirely from the record. Weather descriptions contradicted one another within the same entry. Calm seas followed by crushing ice described as though occurring simultaneously. The men continued to write, but the act grew strained, driven less by duty than by compulsion. There was a growing sense that if the record stopped, something irreversible would occur, though no one articulated what that might be. The taste of metal intensified. It settled into the back of the throat and lingered, persistent and intimate. Mouths felt dry no matter how much snow was melted and consumed. Gums bled unexpectedly. Teeth loosened. Some men noted that the flavor grew stronger at night, coinciding with the deep, rhythmic sounds that traveled through the hull. These observations were written quickly, as if the writers feared lingering on the connection would grant it legitimacy. Dreams intruded into waking hours. Men reported seeing corridors extend beyond their actual length, bulkheads bowing inward like ribs under strain. Lantern light behaved strangely, dimming or flaring without cause. Shadows clung to corners, thickening where walls met floors, as though depth itself were pooling there. The journals attempted to catalog these experiences objectively, stripping them of emotion, but the effort only made them more disturbing. Order dissolved unevenly. Some men clung to routine with ferocity, writing longer entries filled with excessive detail, documenting trivialities as if precision could compensate for the growing sense of wrongness. Others wrote less, their entries reduced to fragments, incomplete sentences trailing off into nothing. Ink blotted pages where hands shook too violently to control the pen. In several books, the same sentence appeared multiple times, written in identical phrasing by different individuals, as though copied from a shared source none could identify. The environment pressed closer. Ice ridges loomed like frozen waves around the ships, their surfaces marked by deep cracks that resembled scars. Wind carried sounds that were not wind alone, low vibrations that resonated through the soles of boots and up into the spine. The journals noted these sensations reluctantly, aware that describing them lent them weight. Yet ignoring them felt dishonest, and dishonesty felt dangerous. Faith appeared in the records with increasing frequency, not as comfort, but as structure. Prayers were written out in full, sometimes repeatedly, their words steady even when handwriting was not. References to providence and testing grew common. Yet alongside them appeared doubt, subtle at first, then more explicit. Questions emerged without answers. Why the taste persisted? Why the ice groaned in patterns? Why the maps refused to remain consistent? These questions were never resolved, only circled endlessly. As weeks blurred into an indistinct mass of darkness and cold, the journals became less a record of exploration and more a catalog of deterioration. Bodies weakened, minds frayed, certainty evaporated. The act of writing no longer imposed order, it revealed chaos. Each page bore silent witness to the same conclusion, written again and again in different forms. The Arctic was not merely an obstacle to be endured. It was an active presence, attentive and responsive, and the men had entered into its awareness without understanding the cost. By the time the realization settled fully, it was already too late to revise the record. The journals continued, but no longer as tools of navigation or discipline. They became symptoms themselves, artifacts of a mind attempting to remain whole while something vast and patient pressed inward, tasting, testing, and learning the shape of human thought. By the second winter, the ships no longer felt empty at night. The darkness did not merely surround them. It entered, settling into passageways and holds with a weight that bent perception. The ice sang when temperatures dropped, a vast and ancient sound, low and grinding, born of pressure and distance. That alone would have been familiar enough to those trained to endure polar silence. But layered beneath it was something else, a slower cadence that could not be explained by shifting flows or contracting wood. It rose and fell with deliberate patience, a pressure that suggested intention rather than accident. Men woke with frost clinging to their beards and lashes, breath rasping in tight chests, and an unshakable certainty that the ship had inhaled while they slept. The sensation was physical, undeniable, as if the hull had expanded subtly around them and then drawn inward again, testing the limits of wood and flesh alike. Some placed their palms against the bulkheads upon waking and swore they felt residual warmth, a faint echo of motion that lingered long after the sound itself had faded. Sleep became unreliable. Rest came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that refused to remain contained. Corridors stretched impossibly long, extending beyond the known dimensions of the ships, narrowing and widening as though alive. Bulkheads flexed like lungs under strain, boards bowing inward and outward in slow rhythm. Shadows gathered where none should exist, pooling in corners, thickening beneath bunks, lingering at the edges of vision even when lanterns were raised. These images did not dissolve upon waking. They followed the men into daylight, overlaying reality like a second skin. The journals reflected this erosion of boundary. Entries grew repetitive, not out of carelessness but compulsion. The same sentences appeared day after day, sometimes word for word, sometimes altered only slightly, as though each writer were tracing an outline already impressed upon the mind. Observations about sound, pressure, and movement recurred with unsettling consistency across different hands. The language simplified, stripped of nuance, reduced to essential phrases that conveyed sensation rather than analysis. The ice itself seemed closer than before. Pressure ridges crept nearer to the hulls, their jagged forms looming like frozen waves poised to break. At times, the ships vibrated subtly beneath foot, not with the sudden violence of impact, but with a sustained tremor that traveled upward through soles and bones. The rhythm of it matched the cadence heard at night, reinforcing the sense that the sound was not external but structural, integrated into the very fabric of the vessels. Men began to orient themselves unconsciously to this pulse. Steps fell into time with it. Breathing adjusted without conscious intent. When the cadence slowed, movements grew heavy and deliberate. When it quickened, anxiety spiked, thoughts racing ahead of reason. The body responded even when the mind resisted, a quiet synchronization that unsettled those who noticed it and consumed those who did not. The taste of metal persisted, stronger now, saturating saliva and clinging stubbornly to the tongue. It accompanied the pulse, intensifying when the sound grew more pronounced, receding slightly when it faded. Mouths felt perpetually dry. Throats burned faintly, as though exposed to something corrosive yet intimate. Some recorded the sensation meticulously, noting variations, attempting to correlate it with temperature, diet, or exertion. No explanation satisfied. Hallucinations deepened. Lantern light bent oddly, casting shadows that lagged behind movement or arrived before it. Faces glimpsed in peripheral vision dissolved when looked at directly, leaving behind a sense of having been observed rather than mistaken. The ships felt larger inside than out, their internal spaces refusing to align with known measurements. Attempts to map passageways resulted in contradictions that could not be resolved, lines overlapping impossibly, distances shifting between attempts. The men grew quieter, not from discipline, but from instinct. Sound felt intrusive, as though it disrupted something that was listening. Even routine tasks were performed with subdued movements, tools handled gently, voices kept low. Laughter vanished entirely, not because morale had collapsed, but because it no longer seemed appropriate, as if joy itself were an offense in this environment. The journals began to blur time. Days lost their sequence. Night and day merged into a continuous dimness broken only by weak shifts in light. Entries referenced events that had not yet occurred or described conditions already past, as if they were present. Corrections were made, then crossed out, then rewritten identically. The act of recording no longer clarified experience, it trapped it in loops. Some men stopped writing altogether, their books left open with unfinished lines trailing into blank space. Others wrote obsessively, filling pages with dense script that ignored margins and structure. Ink smudged where fingers lingered too long, as though reluctant to let go of the pen. In several journals, pressure marks were visible on the paper where words had been written and then erased repeatedly, a physical record of indecision or struggle. The sense of being accompanied grew stronger, not by something visible or audible in the conventional sense, but by a presence implied through absence, through the way spaces felt occupied even when empty. When a man left a compartment, it did not feel vacant. When he returned, it felt altered, as though something had adjusted itself in his absence. The ships responded as well. Sounds multiplied without cause. Ropes creaked though untouched. Metal fittings rang softly in the stillness. Would side under pressure that did not correspond to visible ice movement. These noises aligned themselves into patterns over time, sequences that repeated just often enough to be recognized, but not often enough to be predicted. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It seeped in gradually, diluted by routine and exhaustion. What replaced it was more insidious, acceptance. The men adapted to the rhythms, to the altered perceptions, to the sense of shared occupation. Resistance required energy they no longer possessed. It was easier to listen, to follow the cadence, to allow the nights to pass without question. By the end of the second winter, the journals no longer described a crew isolated in ice. They documented a system, closed and self-sustaining, in which wood, iron, ice, and flesh operated in reluctant harmony. The external world receded into irrelevance. What mattered now was internal alignment, the maintenance of rhythm, the preservation of a balance that felt increasingly fragile. The ships continued to breathe beneath the ice, slow and patient. And the men, waking with frost on their faces and metal on their tongues, adjusted themselves to that breath, writing it into their pages until the words themselves seemed to pulse. When bodies began to fail completely, the order of the expedition collapsed without violence, as if it had simply reached the end of its usefulness. There were no mutinies, no raised fists, no open defiance. Structure dissolved quietly, thread by thread, as flesh proved less durable than intention. Fingers blackened despite careful wrapping, the skin splitting until bone showed pale beneath frost. Some snapped away entirely during routine tasks, breaking with a sound too clean, too dry, to be mistaken for injury. Teeth loosened in swollen gums and fell out without blood, clinking softly against metal plates or disappearing into bedding unnoticed. The men did not react as they might have once. Pain arrived dulled, filtered through exhaustion and the constant metallic film coating the mouth and throat. Hunger no longer behaved as expected. Stomachs tightened and burned, but the sensation lacked urgency, as though appetite itself had been overwritten by something colder and more persistent. The taste of metal grew stronger with each passing day, coating thoughts as thoroughly as it coated saliva, until it became difficult to remember what food had once tasted like. Eating felt ceremonial rather than necessary, an act performed out of habit rather than need. Minds unraveled unevenly. Some men clung desperately to routine long after it had lost meaning, rising at set times, attempting tasks their bodies could no longer complete. Others retreated inward, withdrawing from any semblance of structure. Their eyes tracked movements that no one else acknowledged, following invisible paths along walls and ceilings. Speech became rare, not because throats were frozen, but because words felt insufficient, imprecise, incapable of expressing what pressed inward constantly. It was during this period that men began to leave the ships. No announcement marked their departure. No preparations were made. One moment they were present, the next absent, their belongings untouched, their bunks cold. Footprints led away across the ice in steady lines, boots sinking into powder, steps purposeful rather than frantic. Then, abruptly, the tracks ended. No stumble, no sign of struggle, no indication of collapse. Just an empty stretch of ice, unmarked beyond a certain point, as if the ground itself had closed and smoothed over the intrusion. Searches were attempted at first, brief and unfocused. They always ended the same way, with dizziness, nausea, and a sense of pressure building behind the eyes that forced retreat. The ice behaved strangely underfoot, solid one moment and subtly yielding the next, vibrating faintly as if responding to proximity. After several attempts, the searches ceased. Absence became accepted, folded into the growing list of conditions that could not be changed. Those who remained gravitated below deck. The cold above felt sharper now, more hostile, while the interior of the ships offered a deceptive intimacy. Lantern light was kept low. Men sat or lay pressed against bulkheads, their ears against the wood, listening. They did not speak of what they heard, but their posture suggested concentration rather than fear. There was a belief, unspoken yet shared, that the ships were communicating, that patience would be rewarded with understanding. The hulls responded. Sounds grew more pronounced in enclosed spaces, the slow pressure rising and falling with deliberate consistency. The rhythm that had once been perceived only at night now permeated all hours, a constant presence that set the pace of thought and movement. When it intensified, anxiety spiked collectively, bodies tensing without instruction. When it eased, a heavy calm settled, almost relief, though nothing external had changed. The journals reflected this shift. Entries grew shorter, more fragmented. Observations replaced explanations. The same phrases appeared repeatedly, written in different hands, scrawled across pages without regard for sequence. Mentions of listening became frequent, though rarely elaborated. The ships were described not as vessels, but as structures, then as organisms, then simply as mouths. These transitions occurred gradually, without commentary, as though the writers were unaware of their own changing language. Physical deterioration continued unchecked. Wounds failed to heal. Skin cracked and peeled in thin layers, exposing raw flesh beneath that quickly numbed and darkened. Infections spread silently, their effects muted by cold and exhaustion. Men lost weight rapidly, faces hollowing, eyes sinking deep into skulls. Yet movement persisted. Bodies obeyed some internal directive even as they fell apart, compelled to rise, to walk, to listen. The taste of metal became overwhelming. It coated every breath, every swallow, saturating the senses until it seemed to replace air itself. Some men began to crave it, pressing their tongues against cold metal fittings, licking frost from iron rails, lingering near exposed nails and bolts. The sensation brought a fleeting clarity, a momentary alignment that eased the pressure behind the eyes. These behaviors were not recorded as abnormalities. They were noted without judgment, as if documenting a natural adaptation. Time lost coherence entirely. Days were no longer counted reliably. Sleep occurred in brief, shallow intervals, often interrupted by the sensation of movement beneath the floorboards. Dreams ceased to feel distinct from waking experience. Images bled together, ice cracking open like skin, corridors narrowing until passage was impossible, shadows detaching from bodies and moving independently. These visions were endured rather than questioned. At some point, the concept of rescue vanished from the collective mind. Not rejected, simply forgotten. The outside world receded into abstraction, irrelevant to the immediate reality of pressure, rhythm, and decay. The ships were no longer transports meant to return men home. They were environments, complete and closed, demanding adjustment rather than escape. The few who retained moments of clarity sensed the transformation with muted dread. They recognized that something essential had shifted, that survival had become secondary to comprehension. Yet even this awareness lacked urgency. Resistance required energy they no longer possessed, and the alternative offered a strange, consuming calm. As bodies failed completely, what remained was not despair but submission. The men allowed themselves to be guided by sensation rather than intention, by rhythm rather than reason. They listened more than they acted. They followed the pulse that threaded through wood and ice alike, letting it dictate rest and movement, thought and silence. By the time hunger disappeared entirely, replaced by the constant metallic presence that filled mouths and minds, the expedition no longer resembled a group of explorers trapped by circumstance. It had become a collection of remnants, held together by a shared attention to something vast and patient beneath them. And the ships, breathing steadily under the ice, seemed to approve. The final entries were no longer written for any audience that might one day find them. They were offerings, composed with the understanding that reading was secondary to the act of inscription itself. Ink mixed freely with blood where fingers split open from cold and strain, staining pages in irregular blooms that dried dark and brittle. Words looped back on themselves, lines curling inward, spelling nothing that adhered to any known language. The journals ceased to function as records and became surfaces upon which pressure was relieved, where sensation could be transferred out of the body and into paper. Hands no longer obeyed intent. Pens were held in stiff, clawed grips, guided less by thought than by impulse. The same symbols appeared across multiple books, scratched hastily or pressed deeply until the paper tore. Some marks resembled letters, others anatomical forms, curves and lines suggestive of lungs, ribs, mouths. The writers did not question these shapes. They did not correct them. The act of marking felt necessary, as though failing to do so would invite consequences that could not be endured. Descriptions of the world narrowed. The ships were no longer described as ships. They were referred to as structures, then as chambers, then simply as openings. The language shifted subtly, almost gently, replacing nautical terms with anatomical ones. Decks became surfaces. Hulls became walls. The space beneath the keel was no longer empty water but depth, presence, warmth. The men wrote of it repeatedly, returning to the same observation with increasing certainty. There was heat beneath the ice. This warmth was not comforting. It did not resemble fire or sun. It was described as living, dense, attentive. It pressed upward, slow and persistent, testing the boundary between ice and water, between intrusion and invitation. The journals recorded the belief that this presence had noticed the ships not out of malice but curiosity, drawn by the unnatural intrusion of wood and iron into a domain that had remained undisturbed for longer than memory allowed. Fear was acknowledged briefly, then dismissed. It was no longer useful. What mattered was recognition. The men believed they had been seen, and that visibility demanded response. The ships, trapped and silent above, had become conduits. Sealed shut from the sky by ice and cold, they opened below, offering themselves downward. The hulls were described as lips pressed tight against the frozen surface, straining toward the warmth beneath, inhaling fear and exhaling obedience in a slow, deliberate exchange. This belief took hold without argument. It spread through the journals as a shared understanding, written independently yet identical in essence. The men no longer described themselves as explorers or survivors. They referred to themselves as contents, as components temporarily held within a larger structure. Individual identity thinned, replaced by a sense of participation in something vast and impersonal. The taste of metal reached its final intensity. It saturated every breath, every thought, leaving no room for hunger, thirst, or pain. Eating ceased almost entirely, not as an act of refusal, but of irrelevance. Bodies no longer demanded sustenance in any recognizable way. Instead, attention was directed inward and downward, toward the rhythm that had guided them for so long. The pulse beneath the ice was no longer external. It had been internalized, matched, accepted. The journals recorded moments of clarity in which the men believed they understood their role. The presence beneath the ice did not seek destruction. It sought alignment. The ships had entered its awareness clumsily, loudly, disturbing a balance that had persisted undisturbed. The response was not punishment, but correction. Wood and iron would be repurposed. Flesh and thought would be adjusted. The intrusion would be resolved not through removal, but through assimilation. Language continued to deteriorate. Grammar dissolved. Sentences fractured into lists of sensations and affirmations. Words like waiting, opening, depth, and breath appeared repeatedly, sometimes stacked on top of one another, sometimes circled or underlined until the page tore. Time references vanished entirely. There was no past or future, only duration, measured by pressure and release. Some entries described the sensation of being hollowed, not emptied, but reshaped. The men wrote of a widening within the chest, a sense that something had been removed to make space for something else. This was not recorded as loss. It was described as preparation. The body, weakened and broken, was finally becoming suitable for its purpose. Blood appeared more frequently on the pages, not always from the hands. Smears suggested noses and mouths, perhaps ears. The ink grew lighter as supplies dwindled, but writing did not stop. Charcoal was used, then rust scraped from fittings, then fingernails pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. The need to mark persisted beyond the availability of tools. The ships responded to this progression. The pressure beneath intensified, no longer subtle or intermittent. The hulls vibrated continuously, a deep resonance that traveled through every remaining bone. Men lay flat against the floors, faces pressed to cold planks, breathing shallowly in time with the rhythm. The journals recorded this as success. Alignment was being achieved. The concept of survival vanished entirely from the writing. It was not rejected or argued against. It simply ceased to exist as a consideration. What replaced it was acceptance of function. The men believed they were fulfilling the purpose that had drawn the presence S attention in the first place. Wood, iron, flesh, and thought were converging into a single system, unified by pressure and breath. The final pages were the most difficult to decipher. Ink pooled heavily, words overlapping until they formed dense, unreadable masses. In some books, the pages were torn out and pressed back and backward or upside down. In others, the final entries ended abruptly, mid-mark, as though the writer had been interrupted not by death, but by completion. The last coherent symbols repeated a single idea in varying forms. The ships were open. The warmth was rising. The presence was close. There was no fear recorded in these lines, only a strained reverence, a sense of inevitability that bordered on relief. When the writing stopped entirely, it did so without finality. There was no conclusion, no closing statement, no attempt to summarize or warn. The act of recording simply became unnecessary. Whatever had required inscription had moved beyond the need for translation. The journals lay scattered, blood stiffened and warped by cold, silent witnesses to a transformation that no longer needed words. When searchers eventually came years later, the ships were still there, locked in place with a precision that felt intentional rather than accidental. Ice gripped their hulls tightly, yet the wood showed remarkably little damage, as though decay itself had been discouraged from approaching. Masts leaned at familiar angles, lines frozen mid-sway, rigging stiff as bone. The surrounding ice bore scars of immense pressure, ridges and fractures radiating outward, but the vessels remained intact at the center, preserved unnaturally well, as if time had slowed and hesitated in their immediate vicinity. The air around them felt different. Colder, yes, but also heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that lingered in the throat. The men sent to investigate moved cautiously, voices subdued without conscious decision. Sound behaved strangely here, absorbed rather than echoed, footsteps dull against the ice. The silence pressed inward, broken only by the distant groan of shifting flows and a subtler vibration that traveled up through boots and legs, faint enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to unsettle. Boarding the ships required effort. Hatches resisted opening, not frozen shut, but held fast by pressure that released reluctantly, as though yielding rather than breaking. Inside, the air was stale but not foul. There was no overwhelming stench of decay, no sign of the chaos one would expect after years of abandonment. Lantern light revealed interiors suspended in an arrested state. Tables set, tools laid out, bedding neatly arranged. Dust was minimal. Frost traced delicate patterns along beams and bulkheads, preserving rather than eroding. The journals were found where they had been left, scattered across desks, bunks, and floors. Many were fused shut, pages bonded together by ice and something darker, a brittle residue that flaked away under careful handling. Where they could be opened, entries ended abruptly, mid-sentence, mid-mark, as though the act of writing had been interrupted without warning. Ink stains bled through multiple pages, dark and rust-colored, merging words into illegibility. No final messages appeared. There were no pleas, no explanations, no attempts to summarize or justify what had occurred. What was most disturbing was the absence of bodies. Logic suggested they should be everywhere, collapsed in bunks, slumped against walls, scattered across decks. Instead, the ships were empty. Clothing remained neatly folded or hung. Personal effects lay undisturbed. There were signs of occupation, of prolonged habitation, but no remains to account for the disappearance of an entire crew. The emptiness felt deliberate, curated rather than accidental. Searchers ventured onto the surrounding ice, tracing the perimeter cautiously. Footprints were absent, erased by time and weather, yet the surface bore subtle irregularities, areas where the ice appeared thinner, darker, almost translucent. When stepped upon, these patches vibrated faintly, responding with a gentle tremor that traveled outward in slow waves. The sensation was unmistakable, a delicate but deliberate movement beneath the surface. Beneath the hulls, the ice was thinner than expected. Probing revealed layers that should not have existed, compressed, and altered in ways that defied standard explanation. Those who leaned close reported a sensation of warmth rising faintly from below, not enough to melt, but enough to be felt through gloves and boots. It was accompanied by a low, rhythmic pressure, subtle yet distinct, a rise and fall that echoed the descriptions found in the journals. Some swore they could feel it then, a deep, deliberate exhale rising from beneath the ice. The sensation was not auditory alone. It pressed against the chest, the sinuses, the back of the throat. With it came the unmistakable taste of iron, sharp and intimate, coating the tongue suddenly and persistently. No one spoke immediately. The shared experience required no confirmation. Further examination of the ships revealed structural anomalies. The hulls showed signs of prolonged stress from below rather than from surrounding ice. Timbers were bowed inward, subtly reshaped, as though pressed repeatedly over time by something vast and patient. Metal fittings bore fine abrasions, not from corrosion but from friction, as if brushed against slowly, countless times. The damage was not violent. It was methodical. The searchers began to experience symptoms themselves. Headaches emerged within hours, a dull pressure that resisted relief. Some reported dizziness, a sense of disorientation that made distance difficult to judge. Lantern light seemed weaker below deck, shadows lingering longer than expected. The metallic taste returned intermittently, strongest near the lowest compartments, where the ice pressed closest to the hull. Orders were given to limit time aboard. No one argued. The ships inspired a quiet urgency, an instinctive understanding that prolonged exposure was unwise. Yet even as preparations were made to depart, several men found themselves lingering, hands resting against bulkheads, ears tilted toward the floor. They reported nothing specific, only a sensation of listening being reciprocated. The journals were removed with care, bundled and sealed, though some resisted separation from their surroundings. Pages cracked when forced apart, releasing a faint metallic dust that clung to skin and fabric. The men handling them wore gloves, yet later complained of the taste lingering despite precautions. Water did nothing to remove it. Before departure, one final survey was conducted beneath the hulls. The ice trembled again, more noticeably this time, a gentle but undeniable response to proximity. The warmth intensified briefly, then receded. Those present felt an overwhelming impression of containment rather than emptiness, as though what had once occupied the ships had not vanished but relocated, redistributed into the surrounding environment. As the search party withdrew, the ships remained unchanged, locked in their frozen cradle. The ice settled gradually, smoothing over disturbances left by human movement. The low vibration persisted for a time, then faded into the background, indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the Arctic. Reports filed afterward struggled for language. Official documents described preservation, mystery, and environmental anomalies. Privately, the men spoke of breath, of pressure, of the sensation of being acknowledged and dismissed. None could adequately explain the absence of bodies or the condition of the ships without resorting to speculation that felt dangerously inadequate. The Arctic reclaimed its stillness slowly. Snow drifted over tracks, wind erased signs of intrusion. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The searchers carried the taste of iron with them long after they left, a reminder that the ice was not merely a barrier, but a participant. The ships had not simply trapped their crews. They had served as instruments, conduits through which something ancient had learned the shape of human presence. Beneath the frozen sea, the pressure continued its patient rhythm. And in the vast white silence, it felt increasingly plausible that the Arctic itself had learned to breathe by consuming everyone who came looking for the truth.